Lawyer recognizes boyfriend's watch on a street vendor and makes a shocking discovery. On a typical afternoon in New York, lawyer Sarah Thompson, still recovering from the loss of her boyfriend in a tragic car accident 6 months ago, has her life turned upside down when she notices a familiar watch on the wrist of a street vendor. What seemed like an unlikely coincidence turns into a journey full of mysteries, shocking revelations, and moral dilemmas that will not only challenge everything Sarah thought she knew about her past, but also force her to question the boundaries between justice, love, and forgiveness. Sarah Thompson adjusted her thin-framed glasses as she watched the bustle of Park Avenue from her 35th-floor office window. The constant sound of honking horns and the frenetic movement of people below contrasted with the oppressive silence that surrounded her. At 32, Sarah was the epitome of professional success, a promising lawyer at one of New York's most prestigious firms. However, her green eyes, once bright and full of life, now carried a shadow of sadness that even her professional accomplishments couldn't dispel. Her fingers unconsciously brushed the sapphire pendant hanging from a delicate chain around her neck. A gift from Michael, her boyfriend, on the last birthday they spent together. The memory of the accident that took him from her 6 months ago was still an open wound, painfully pulsing with every breath. Sarah sighed, turning away from the window and returning to her polished mahogany desk. Neatly organized stacks of files awaited her, a welcome distraction from the pain that still consumed her. She forced herself to focus on work, diving into the complexities of a corporate fraud case that promised to be her biggest challenge yet. The hours dragged on as she pored over documents and prepared arguments. When she finally glanced at the clock, she realized it was already past 9 p.m. The office was almost empty, with only the soft hum of the air conditioning breaking the silence. Exhausted, Sarah decided it was time to go home. As she packed her briefcase, her eyes fell on a framed photo on her desk. Her and Michael smiling in front of the Statue of Liberty, the wind tousling their hair. The date engraved in the lower right corner marked exactly 1 year ago. With a lump in her throat, Sarah placed the photo in the drawer. She wasn't ready to let go of it, but seeing it every day was becoming unbearable. Grabbing her coat and bag, she headed to the elevator, exchanging a tired wave with the night guard. The cool night air hit her as she stepped out of the building. Sarah decided to walk a bit before hailing a cab, hoping the exercise would clear her mind. The streets of Manhattan were still buzzing with life, even at that hour. As she walked, lost in thought, something caught her attention. A street vendor was arranging his stall, preparing to close for the day. Normally, Sarah would barely notice such a common scene, but something made her stop abruptly. On the man's wrist, shining under a nearby streetlight, was a watch she would recognize anywhere. A vintage Omega Speedmaster, with a worn brown leather strap and a small scratch on the upper right corner of the dial. Michael's watch. Sarah's heart raced, her mind a whirlwind of thoughts. How could that man be wearing Michael's watch? The watch that should have been destroyed along with the car in the accident? She felt her legs weaken, leaning against a nearby wall for support. The vendor, noticing her fixed gaze, smiled warmly. "Interested in something, miss? I'm closing up, but I can make you a good deal." Sarah opened her mouth to respond, but the words caught in her throat. Her mind spun with possibilities, each more unlikely than the last. As the man continued to pack up his stall, seemingly oblivious to the storm of emotions he had unleashed, Sarah knew her life was about to change drastically once again. With trembling hands, she pulled out her phone. She needed to call someone, do something, but who would believe her? How could she explain something she didn't even understand herself? The vendor began to push his cart away, taking with him the enigma that now consumed Sarah. She knew she had to make a quick decision. Follow the man and confront him? Call the police? Or simply go home and try to convince herself that this was just a bizarre coincidence? As the sound of the cart's wheels mixed with the city's noise, Sarah felt the weight of a choice that would change the course of her life forever. Whatever she decided to do next, she knew nothing would be the same. Sarah's heart pounded frantically as she watched the street vendor walk away, Michael's watch shining on his wrist like a beacon in the night. Her mind screamed for her to act, but her feet seemed glued to the ground. Wait! The word escaped her lips before she could think better of it. The vendor stopped, turning with a curious expression. Sarah approached, trying to control the tremor in her voice. "Excuse me, but that watch, where did you get it?" The man, a middle-aged gentleman with deep wrinkles around his eyes, glanced at the watch and shrugged. "Oh, this? Bought it at a thrift shop a few weeks ago. Nice, isn't it? Got lucky finding a piece like this at such a good price." Sarah's mind whirled. A thrift shop? How could Michael's watch end up in a thrift shop? "Do you remember which thrift shop?" The vendor frowned, thoughtful. It was in Queens, I think. Can't remember the exact name, but it's near the Jamaica Van Wyck subway station." Sarah felt a rush of adrenaline. It was a lead, however tenuous. "How much do you want for it?" The words tumbled out of her mouth before she could think. The man seemed surprised. "Oh, it's not for sale, miss. It's my personal watch." "Please," Sarah insisted, her voice nearly breaking. "It's very important to me. I'll pay you double what you paid." The vendor studied her for a moment, clearly intrigued by her insistence. "Look, I really don't want to sell it, but..." He hesitated, glancing at the watch. "If it's that important to you, how about $1,000? Sarah almost laughed in relief. $1,000 was nothing compared to the sentimental value of the watch. "Deal," she said quickly, already reaching into her bag for her checkbook. Minutes later, with the watch securely in her hands, Sarah found herself alone on the sidewalk, the reality of her situation finally sinking in. What had she just done? Bought a watch from a stranger on the street based solely on a resemblance? What if it wasn't Michael's watch? What if it was just a cruel coincidence? But as she examined the watch under the streetlight, there was no doubt in her mind. The small scratch on the corner, the way the strap was worn exactly where Michael used to adjust it, it was his watch without a shadow of a doubt. Sarah felt tears welling up in her eyes. If this was Michael's watch, how had it survived the accident? And more importantly, why was it being sold in a thrift shop in Queens? Suddenly, the story of the accident she had accepted as the truth began to unravel in her mind. Michael had died in a head-on collision on the interstate. The car had caught fire. There was no body to bury, only ashes. But if the watch survived, Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. What if Michael wasn't in the car? What if he was still alive? The idea was absurd, she knew that. People don't just fake their own deaths and disappear. Especially not Michael, who was the most honest and reliable person she had ever known. But the doubt had already set in, and Sarah knew she wouldn't have peace until she discovered the truth. With trembling hands, she pulled out her phone and opened the rideshare app. Queens. She needed to go to Queens now, find that thrift shop and start piecing together this impossible puzzle. As she waited for the car to arrive, Sarah looked again at the watch in her hands. She was about to dive into something that could change her life forever. There was a voice in her head begging her to stop, to accept the loss and move on. But another voice, stronger, urged her to continue. The car arrived, and Sarah got in, giving the approximate address of the subway station in Queens. As the vehicle pulled away from downtown Manhattan, she looked out the window at the illuminated skyscrapers. Her orderly, predictable life was fading into the distance. Ahead lay the unknown, full of unanswered questions and daunting possibilities. But one thing was certain. Sarah Thompson would not rest until she found the truth, no matter where this search led her. Sarah felt the weight of the watch in her pocket as she walked through the bustling streets of Queens. The night air was thick with the aromas of food from various ethnic restaurants, mingling with the unmistakable scent of the city. Her eyes scanned every store, desperately searching for a thrift shop. After nearly an hour of fruitless searching, she spotted a faded sign, "Past Treasures Thrift Shop." Sarah's heart raced as she approached the dusty storefront. The shop appeared to be closing, an elderly woman tidying up some clothes. Sarah knocked on the glass, her fingers trembling. The woman looked up, frowning, but eventually opened the door. "We're closing, dear," she said with an accent Sarah couldn't place. "Please, Sarah pleaded. I just need some information. It's very important. The woman hesitated for a moment before sighing and opening the door wider. 5 minutes, she said firmly. Sarah stepped inside, the smell of mothballs and old books filling her nostrils. She pulled the watch from her pocket, showing it to the woman. This watch. It was sold here a few weeks ago. I need to know who brought it in. The woman took the watch, examining it with experienced eyes. Ah, yes, I remember this one. A beautiful piece. She looked at Sarah with curiosity. Why do you want to know? Sarah hesitated. How could she explain something she didn't fully understand? It belonged to my boyfriend. He died 6 months ago. This watch was supposed to have been destroyed with him. The woman's eyes widened in understanding. Oh dear, she murmured, her voice softening. What a sad story. But I can't just reveal information about our customers. Please, Sarah insisted, feeling tears well up. You don't understand. If this watch is here, it means something about his death doesn't add up. I need to understand what happened. The woman studied her for a long moment, as if weighing the consequences of her actions. Finally, she sighed. Normally, I wouldn't do this, but I see this means a lot to you. She walked to the counter and pulled out a large ledger. Let's see. It was about 3 weeks ago. Sarah held her breath as the woman flipped through the pages. Ah, here it is. The watch was brought in by a man. Didn't give a name, paid in cash. What did he look like? Sarah asked anxiously. The woman frowned, trying to remember. Tall, dark hair. Wore sunglasses and a cap. Seemed nervous now that I think about it. Wanted to get rid of the watch quickly. Sarah felt her heart race. The description could easily match Michael. But why would he be hiding? Why fake his own death? Is there anything else you can tell me? Sarah asked, desperate for more information. The woman hesitated again. Well, he dropped this when he left. She reached down and pulled something from a drawer. It was a crumpled business card. Sarah took the card with trembling hands. Printed on it was, Dr. Alan Richter, plastic surgeon. A million thoughts raced through Sarah's mind. Plastic surgery? Was Michael changing his appearance? But why? Thank you, Sarah murmured, pocketing the card. You have no idea how much this means to me. As she left the shop, Sarah felt like she was walking on quicksand. Each answer only led to more questions. She looked at the card in her hand, knowing her next stop would be the office of this Dr. Richter. As she made her way back to the subway station, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she was getting closer to something much bigger and potentially more dangerous than she could imagine. But she had come too far to turn back now. With Michael's watch weighing in her pocket and the surgeon's business card in her hand, Sarah boarded the train back to Manhattan, determined to unravel the mystery, no matter the cost. Sarah adjusted her blazer and took a deep breath before entering the luxurious building on Park Avenue. Dr. Alan Richter's office occupied the entire 15th floor, a silent testament to the success and discretion that attracted an exclusive clientele. The receptionist, a middle-aged woman with a practiced smile, looked up as Sarah approached. May I help you? Yes, I'd like to speak with Dr. Richter, please. It's urgent. The receptionist frowned. I'm sorry, but Dr. Richter only sees patients by appointment. I can schedule you for next week. Sarah felt panic rising. A week was too long. Please, it's really important. I just need 5 minutes. I'm sorry, but it's all right, Claire. A male voice interrupted. A tall man with graying hair and a white coat appeared in the doorway. Can I help you, miss? Thompson. Sarah Thompson. She extended her hand, which the doctor shook firmly. Dr. Alan Richter. What can I do for you, Miss Thompson? Sarah hesitated, conscious of the receptionist's attentive ears. Can we speak in private? Dr. Richter studied her for a moment before nodding. This way. In the consultation room, Sarah found herself surrounded by framed diplomas and photographs of unrecognizable celebrities, likely the before of their procedures. So, Miss Thompson, what brings you here with such urgency? Sarah pulled the crumpled business card from her pocket. This card was left by a man at a thrift shop in Queens a few weeks ago. A man who might have been my boyfriend, who supposedly died 6 months ago. Dr. Richter took the card, his expression unreadable. I understand your confusion, but I must remind you that doctor-patient confidentiality. Doctor, Sarah interrupted, her voice trembling. I'm not asking for medical details. I just need to know if he was here, if he's alive. The doctor sighed, rubbing his forehead. Miss Thompson, even if I wanted to help, I can't confirm or deny the presence of any patient in my office. Sarah felt tears welling up. Please, you don't understand. If he's alive, I need to know why he faked his death. Why he left me believing he was dead. Dr. Richter watched her for a long moment, his face a mask of professional conflict. Finally, he stood and walked to a locked file cabinet. What I'm about to do goes against all medical protocols, he said quietly, rifling through some papers. But there's something about your story that, well, let's just say it strikes a chord. He returned with a thin file. About 5 months ago, a man came to see me. He paid in cash, used a fake name, and requested a complete facial change. Said it was a matter of life and death. Sarah held her breath. Was it him? Was it Michael? Dr. Richter opened the file and slid a photo toward her. Sarah felt the world spin. It was Michael, but not quite. His face was swollen and bruised, as if he had been beaten. But the eyes, those blue eyes she knew so well, were unmistakable. Oh my God, she whispered. He was scared, Dr. Richter continued. Said dangerous people were after him. That faking his death was the only way to protect someone he loved. Sarah felt like she had been punched in the stomach. Michael was alive. He had faked his death. To protect her? Where is he now? She asked, her voice barely audible. Dr. Richter shook his head. I don't know. After the surgery, he disappeared. But he left this. He handed Sarah a folded piece of paper. Said if anyone came looking for him, to give them this. With trembling hands, Sarah unfolded the paper. Written in Michael's familiar handwriting was a single line. Bellamy's, Thursday, 10 p.m. Come alone. Sarah looked at Dr. Richter, her mind a whirlwind of emotions. Today's Thursday. The doctor nodded gravely. Miss Thompson, I don't know what your boyfriend was involved in, but it seemed dangerous. Be careful. Sarah stood, feeling dizzy. Thank you, Dr. Richter, for everything. As she left the office, Sarah checked her watch. 8:45 p.m. She had just over an hour to get to Bellamy's, a discreet bar in the Lower East Side. As she hailed a cab, Sarah felt a mix of fear and anticipation. In a few minutes, she would finally have answers. But would they be the answers she wanted to hear? Bellamy's was a discreet pub tucked away on a narrow street in the Lower East Side. Sarah arrived at 9:55 p.m., her heart pounding in her chest. The interior was dimly lit, with most of the illumination coming from soft lights above the worn wooden tables. She chose a stool at the bar, ordered a gin and tonic she knew she wouldn't drink, and waited. Her eyes scanned every face, every movement. At 10:05 p.m., the door opened. A tall, slender man entered, wearing a cap pulled low and sunglasses, despite the late hour. Sarah felt her heart stop. Even with the changes, she would recognize that posture anywhere. The man sat 2 stools away from her, not looking in her direction. Don't react, he murmured, his voice so familiar that Sarah had to restrain herself from crying. Just keep looking forward. Michael, she whispered, her voice trembling. What's going on? He ordered a beer before answering. I'm sorry, Sarah, for everything. I never wanted to hurt you. Hurt? Sarah hissed, struggling to keep her voice low. I thought you were dead. Michael sighed deeply. I know, and believe me, every day away from you was torture. But it was necessary to keep you safe. Safe from what? Michael took a sip of his beer. Remember that case I was working on? About bid rigging in the city's contracts. Sarah nodded. Michael was a private investigator and had mentioned a major case weeks before his supposed accident. I stumbled onto something big, Sarah. Much bigger than just bid rigging. We're talking corrupt politicians and scrupulous businessmen, and the mob. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. The mob. Yes, when they realized I was getting too close, they tried to kill me. That car accident? It wasn't an accident. Sarah fought back nausea. But why fake your death? Why not go to the police? Michael laughed bitterly. The police are involved, Sarah. At least some of them. I didn't know who to trust. The only way to keep you safe was to make everyone believe I was dead. And now? Sarah asked, finally turning to look at him. Even with the sunglasses and cap, she could see the subtle changes in his face. Why contact me now? Michael hesitated. Because I finally have all the evidence. Documents, recordings, everything. But I need your help to make it public. Sarah felt the weight of the situation settle on her shoulders. My help? How? You're a lawyer, Sarah. You have connections, you know how to navigate the legal system. I need you to take this evidence to the federal authorities, away from local influence. He slid a flash drive across the bar. Sarah took it, feeling like she was holding a bomb. Michael, this is crazy. You're asking me to put myself in the crosshairs of these people. I know it's a lot to ask, Michael said, his voice breaking, but you're the only person I can trust. The only one with the skills and integrity to do this. Sarah closed her eyes, feeling the world spin around her. When she opened them again, she saw Michael getting up. I have to go. It's not safe to stay in one place for too long. He hesitated, then pulled something from his pocket. It was a key. Apartment 5B, 1424, East 7th Street. If you decide to help me, meet me there tomorrow at midnight. If not, well, I'll understand. Before Sarah could respond, Michael was already at the door. He paused for a moment, looking back. I love you, Sarah. I always have. I'm sorry for all of this. And then he was gone, leaving Sarah alone with a flash drive full of dangerous secrets, a key to an unknown apartment, and a decision that could change not just her life, but potentially the entire city. She looked at the untouched gin and tonic in front of her, wishing it were strong enough to wash away the confusion and fear now dominating her thoughts. With trembling hands, she picked up the glass and downed it in one gulp. The night had only just begun, and Sarah knew the next hours would be the longest of her life. Sarah barely slept that night. Her dreams were a chaotic mix of dark chases and faceless figures. When she finally gave up on trying to sleep, the sun was just beginning to rise over the Manhattan skyline. With a cup of strong coffee in hand, she stared at the flash drive on the coffee table. That small object contained information that could bring down a corruption network but could also put her life in danger. Sarah picked up her phone several times, almost calling her best friend, Jenna, or her mentor at the law firm. But each time she hesitated. The fewer people who knew, the safer it would be for everyone. The hours passed in a blur of anxiety and indecision. Sarah alternated between moments of fierce determination and waves of paralyzing fear. As the day wore on, she found herself replaying every moment of her life with Michael, looking for signs she might have missed, clues that something was wrong. At 11:30 p.m., Sarah found herself standing in front of the mirror, dressed in dark, discreet clothes. The flash drive was secure in her pocket, weighing heavily. The key Michael had given her was in her hand, cold against her sweaty palm. You can do this, she murmured to her reflection, not entirely convinced. The taxi dropped her off a block from the address Michael had provided. Sarah walked quickly, her eyes scanning the shadows for any suspicious movement. The building was old, with a worn facade that blended perfectly with the other buildings on the street. Inside, the lobby was empty and dimly lit. Sarah climbed the stairs, her heart pounding louder with each step. On the 5th floor, she stopped in front of apartment 5B, the key trembling in her hand. Taking a deep breath, she inserted the key into the lock and turned it. The door opened with a soft creak, revealing a small, sparsely furnished apartment. Sarah stepped in cautiously, closing the door behind her. Michael? She called softly. There was no answer. Sarah moved further into the apartment. A table in the corner was covered with papers and an open laptop. On the wall, a large map of the city was marked with colored pins and strings connecting various points. As she examined the documents on the table, the sound of a key turning in the lock made her freeze. Sarah turned, her heart racing, hoping to see Michael. But it wasn't Michael who entered. A tall man in a dark suit stepped into the apartment, his eyes widening in surprise at the sight of Sarah. "Who are you?" he demanded, his hand moving toward the inside of his jacket. Sarah backed away, her brain working frantically. I'm Michael Thompson's lawyer," she improvised, silently thanking her years of experience thinking on her feet in court. The man narrowed his eyes. "Thompson doesn't have a lawyer." "He does now," Sarah replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "And who are you?" The man hesitated for a moment before relaxing slightly. "Detective James Callahan, NYPD." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. Michael had said the police were involved. Was this man one of the corrupt ones or one of the good ones? "Where's Thompson?" Callahan asked, his eyes scanning the apartment. "I don't know," Sarah replied honestly. "He was supposed to be here." Callahan stepped forward, his posture intimidating. "Listen, miss?" "Thompson," Sarah replied automatically, cursing herself the moment the name left her mouth. Callahan's eyes widened in recognition. Sarah Thompson, the supposedly dead girlfriend of Michael. Sarah realized her mistake too late. She took a step back, feeling the edge of the table pressing against her back. Callahan advanced, his face a mask of determination. "I think we have a lot to talk about, Miss Thompson. About Michael, about what you know, and about what you're doing here." At that moment, Sarah realized she was at a crossroads. Trust this unknown detective or try to escape with the information Michael had entrusted to her. Her hand brushed the papers on the table behind her, feeling the outline of the flash drive hidden among them. With a quick movement, she grabbed it, determined to protect the evidence at all costs. "We really do have a lot to talk about, Detective," she said, stalling for time as her mind raced for an escape plan. "But I think it would be better to do it in a more official setting." Callahan gave a cold smile. "Oh, don't worry, Miss Thompson. I have the perfect place in mind." The distant sound of sirens began to grow, and Sarah felt her stomach sink. The night was far from over, and she had a feeling things were about to get much more complicated. The wail of sirens grew louder, echoing through the narrow streets. Sarah felt panic rising in her throat, but years of courtroom experience helped her maintain her composure. "Detective Callahan," she said, keeping her voice steady. "Before we go anywhere, I'd like to make a call to my office." Callahan laughed, a cold, humorless sound. "I'm sorry, Miss Thompson, but I don't think that's going to be possible." In that instant, Sarah knew her suspicions were correct. Callahan couldn't be trusted. In a swift motion, she grabbed the lamp from the nearby table and hurled it at Callahan. The detective dodged, but the distraction was enough. Sarah ran to the back window, which led to the fire escape. "Stop!" Callahan shouted, but Sarah was already out, her feet clanging against the rusty metal of the escape. She descended as quickly as she could, her heart hammering in her chest. Above, she could hear Callahan cursing as he followed her. The sirens were closer now. Reaching the alley below, Sarah sprinted, turning a corner and then another. She didn't know this part of the city well, but she knew she needed to lose herself in the crowd. After several minutes of frantic running, she finally slowed, blending into the nighttime pedestrian traffic. Her phone vibrated in her pocket. A message from an unknown number. "Delancey Saint Subway, South Platform, 10 minutes. Sarah hesitated. Could be a trap, but it might also be her only chance to understand what was happening. Deciding to take the risk, she headed for the station. On the South Platform, Sarah waited anxiously, her eyes scanning every face. When the train arrived, she nearly missed the hooded figure who appeared beside her. "Get on," said the familiar voice. "Michael." Inside the nearly empty carriage, Michael pulled down his hood. His face was different, changed by the surgery, but his eyes were unmistakably Michael's. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice full of concern. Sarah nodded, still catching her breath. "Callahan? Is he one of the corrupt ones?" Michael sighed heavily. "Yes, he's one of the key players in this corruption network." "Sarah, I'm so sorry for getting you involved. I had no idea he would show up at the apartment." "Michael, what's really going on? I need to know everything." As the subway sped through the city, Michael began to tell his story. He explained how, during a routine investigation, he had stumbled upon evidence of a massive corruption scheme involving high-ranking politicians, businessmen, and members of the mob. They're diverting millions of dollars from public contracts, hospitals, schools, infrastructure. The money that's supposed to go to these things is going straight into their pockets. Sarah absorbed the information, horrified at the scale of the scheme. "And why fake your death? When I realized how deep the corruption ran, I knew I was in danger. But more than that, I knew they'd come after you to get to me. Faking my death was the only way to keep you safe while I gathered all the evidence." Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes. "You have no idea how much it hurt to think you were dead." Michael knelt in front of her, taking her hands in his. "Sarah, I'm so sorry. More than you can imagine. But it was the only way to keep you safe while I worked to bring them down." She nodded, understanding but still feeling the weight of the pain from the past months. "So what's the plan now?" Michael stood, walking to the monitors. "Tomorrow we'll meet with an FBI agent I trust. She's outside the reach of Callahan and his allies and can start a federal investigation." "And if that doesn't work?" Sarah asked, the fear evident in her voice. Michael looked at her, his eyes filled with determination and fear. "Then we go to the press. I have contacts in newspapers across the country. If we can't get justice through official channels, we'll make sure the world knows what's happening here." Sarah held the flash drive tightly. "What do we do now?" Michael glanced at the clock. "Now we keep moving. I know a place we can stay tonight, and tomorrow we'll contact the FBI agent." As they exited the subway and climbed the stairs to the street, Sarah felt the weight of the situation pressing down on her. Her life had changed irrevocably in the past 24 hours. Now, she was at the center of a conspiracy that threatened to shake the foundations of the city she loved. Looking at Michael, who walked briskly ahead of her, Sarah knew there was no turning back. She was fully committed now, for better or worse. With the flash drive secure in her pocket and determination growing in her chest, Sarah followed Michael into the New York night, ready to face whatever came next. The rising sun painted the sky with hues of orange and pink as Michael finally slowed the boat. They had been sailing for hours, leaving the city behind and following the coastline. There, Michael pointed to a small cove surrounded by dense trees. "That's our destination." Sarah frowned, confused. "Where exactly are we?" "Long Island," Michael replied, skillfully maneuvering the boat toward the shore. "There's a safe house here, a place even Callahan and his crew don't know about." They docked the boat at a small, hidden pier and walked along a narrow path through the woods. After a few minutes, they arrived at a wooden cabin, almost invisible among the trees. Michael entered a code into a discreet keypad, and the door clicked open. "Come on in," he said, glancing nervously over his shoulder before following her inside. The interior was surprisingly modern, despite the rustic exterior. One wall was covered with monitors, displaying feeds from security cameras around the property. "Wow," Sarah murmured, impressed by the setup. "Welcome to my base of operations for the past few months," Michael said with a weary smile. "It's not much, but it's safe." Sarah sat on a worn sofa, feeling the exhaustion of the past day wash over her. "Michael, we need to talk. About everything." He nodded, sitting beside her. "I know. Where do you want to start?" "From the beginning," she said firmly. "How did you find out about all this?" Michael sighed deeply. "It was by accident, actually. I was investigating a minor bribery case involving a city official. But the more I dug, the more I realized it was just the tip of the iceberg." He stood and walked over to a table covered in papers. "Look at this," he said, handing Sarah a stack of documents. Overpriced contracts, shell companies, offshore accounts. It all leads back to a group of politicians and businessmen at the top. Sarah flipped through the papers, her stomach turning as she grasped the scale of the corruption. My God, Michael, this is huge. And deadly, he added grimly. When I started getting too close, they tried to silence me. The car accident was just the beginning. I realized the only way to continue investigating was to disappear completely. Tears formed in Sarah's eyes. You have no idea how much it hurt to think you were dead. Michael knelt before her, taking her hands. Sarah, I'm so sorry. More than you can imagine. But it was the only way to keep you safe while I gathered the evidence. She nodded, understanding but still feeling the weight of the pain from the past months. So, what's the plan? Michael walked over to the monitors, bringing up a map of the city. Tomorrow we'll meet with an FBI agent I trust. She's outside the local influence and can start a federal investigation. And if that doesn't work? Sarah asked, the fear evident in her voice. Michael looked at her, his eyes filled with determination. Then we go to the press. I have contacts in newspapers across the country. If we can't get justice through official channels, we'll make sure the world knows what's happening. Sarah clutched the flash drive in her pocket. What do we do now? Now we organize the evidence, Michael replied, inserting the flash drive into a computer. And then we prepare for tomorrow. Hours passed as they sifted through documents, cross-referencing information, and creating a comprehensive dossier on the corruption network. The sun was high in the sky when they finally finished. Done, Michael said, leaning back in his chair. We have everything here. Bank records, audio recordings, incriminating videos. It's enough to bring down the whole operation. Sarah looked at the screen, feeling the enormity of the responsibility. And now, Michael picked up a satellite phone. Now, we make the call that could change everything. He dialed a number and waited. After a few rings, a female voice answered. Special Agent Rodriguez, Michael said, his voice tense. It's time. There was a pause on the other end. Then, understood. Meeting point Charlie. 2 hours. The call ended abruptly. Michael turned to Sarah, his eyes shining with a mix of hope and apprehension. This is it, Sarah. We're about to blow open the biggest corruption scandal this city has ever seen. Sarah felt a shiver run down her spine. It was thrilling and terrifying at the same time. And if something goes wrong? Michael took her hand, squeezing it gently. Then we'll face it together, like we always have. They began preparing for the meeting, gathering the evidence and taking every precaution. The air was thick with tension and anticipation. As they were about to leave, Sarah paused, looking at Michael. No matter what happens, she said softly, I'm glad we're in this together. Michael smiled, the first genuine smile she had seen on his face in a long time. Me too, Sarah. Me too. With one last look at the cabin that had been their refuge, they set out, ready to face whatever the future held. The path ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. The truth was about to come to light, and nothing would ever be the same. The air in the underground tunnels was damp and heavy, laden with the scent of mildew and forgotten history. Sarah and Michael moved quickly, their footsteps echoing against the stone walls. Where are we going? Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of dripping water. There's an exit about 1 kilometer from here, Michael replied, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. It'll bring us out near the East River. Suddenly, the sound of distant voices reached them. Sarah felt her heart leap into her throat. There in the tunnels, she murmured, panic creeping into her voice. Michael nodded gravely. We need to move faster. They quickened their pace, the sounds of their pursuers growing louder with each step. The tunnel branched off in several directions, and Michael hesitated for a moment before choosing a path. Are you sure this is the right way? Sarah asked, glancing nervously over her shoulder. Pretty sure, Michael answered, tension clear in his voice. These tunnels are a maze. It's our best chance to lose them. They ran for several more minutes, turning down blind corners and passing through abandoned chambers. The sound of their pursuers seemed to fluctuate, sometimes growing distant, other times alarmingly close. Suddenly, Michael stopped abruptly, causing Sarah to bump into him. "What is it?" she asked, breathless. Michael pointed ahead. The tunnel ended in a solid wall. "No, no, no," he muttered, turning in circles with the flashlight. "There must be another way out." The sound of footsteps echoed behind them, much closer now. "Michael," Sarah whispered urgently. "What do we do?" He glanced around frantically, then his eyes fixed on something above them. "There!" he exclaimed, pointing to a metal grate in the ceiling. "It's a maintenance exit. Help me reach it." Sarah clasped her hands together, forming a foothold. Michael stepped into her hands, stretching to reach the grate. With a grunt of effort, he pushed it open. "Quick!" he said, extending a hand to Sarah. She jumped, grabbing his hand. With a strong pull, Michael hoisted her up just as the beams of flashlights appeared around the bend in the tunnel. They found themselves in a narrow alley, the cool night air a welcome relief from the stifling tunnels. Without pausing, they started running again. "Where to now?" Sarah asked between gasps for breath. "The river," Michael replied. "I've got a boat hidden there. It's our best shot at getting out of the city." They ran through the deserted streets, the distant wail of sirens spurring them on. Finally, they reached a small dock hidden behind a cluster of warehouses. A motorboat was moored there, gently bobbing on the dark water. Michael jumped in, helping Sarah aboard. With practiced movements, he started the engine. As they pulled away from the shore, beams of light appeared on the dock. Shots rang out, bullets splashing into the water around them. Sarah ducked, her heart racing. Michael maneuvered the boat expertly, zigzagging to avoid the gunfire. Gradually, the sound of the shots faded, replaced by the roar of the engine and the lapping of waves against the hull. Sarah finally allowed herself to relax a little, looking at Michael. His face was tense, focused on navigating. "Where are we going?" she asked. Michael glanced at her, his eyes reflecting the city lights. "Somewhere safe. A place where we can finally expose all of this." As the boat sped through the dark waters, leaving the illuminated city behind, Sarah felt a mix of fear and hope. They had escaped for now, but the fight was far from over. The horizon began to lighten with the first signs of dawn. A new day was coming, bringing with it the promise of danger but also the possibility of justice. Sarah looked at the flash drive in her pocket, then at Michael. Together, they held the power to change everything, and she was ready to face whatever came next. The rising sun bathed the sky in shades of gold and pink as Michael finally slowed the boat. They had been traveling for hours, putting as much distance between them and the city as possible. "There," Michael pointed to a secluded inlet surrounded by dense trees. "That's where we're headed." Sarah frowned, still feeling the adrenaline coursing through her. "Where exactly are we?" "Long Island," Michael replied, steering the boat toward the shore. "There's a safe house here, a place known only to a few." They docked at a small, hidden pier and followed a narrow path through the woods. After a short walk, they arrived at a small, inconspicuous cabin. Its weathered exterior was hidden among the thick foliage. Michael keyed in a code on a hidden keypad, and the door unlocked with a soft click. "Come on in," he said, glancing back to make sure they weren't followed. Inside, the cabin was modest but equipped with modern amenities. One wall was covered with monitors displaying feeds from various security cameras around the property. "Not exactly homey, but it's safe," Michael said, switching on a few more lights. Sarah looked around, impressed despite her exhaustion. "How did you set all this up?" Michael smiled wearily. "With a lot of help from some trusted friends. People who want to see this corruption exposed as much as we do." He led her to a small living area where they both collapsed onto a worn sofa. "We have a lot to do," he said, pulling out the flash drive from his pocket. Sarah nodded, feeling the weight of the situation settle on her shoulders. "What's the plan?" Michael took a deep breath. We organize the evidence and then contact the FBI agent I trust. She can take it from there. They spent the next few hours sorting through the documents and files, carefully preparing everything they needed to hand over to the authorities. As they worked, Michael explained how he had uncovered the corruption network, starting from a simple case of bribery and leading to a tangled web involving high-level politicians and organized crime. They're siphoning off millions meant for public projects, Michael explained, his voice tight with anger. It's affecting hospitals, schools, infrastructure, things that matter to ordinary people. Sarah felt a surge of determination. We have to stop them. Michael nodded, his face grim. And we will, but we need to be smart about it. The people involved won't go down without a fight. As they neared the end of their preparations, Michael checked his watch. It's time to make the call. He picked up a secure phone and dialed a number. After a few rings, a woman's voice answered. "Special Agent Rodriguez," Michael said, his voice steady. "It's Michael. We have everything." There was a pause. Then the voice on the other end responded. "Understood. Location Charlie in 2 hours." Michael hung up and turned to Sarah. "It's set. We meet her in 2 hours." Sarah felt a mix of fear and anticipation. "Are we sure we can trust her?" Michael nodded. "She's one of the few clean ones, but we still need to be careful. If anyone finds out what we're doing, they'll try to stop us." They quickly gathered the evidence and prepared for the meeting. As they finished, Michael pulled Sarah into a tight hug. "No matter what happens, I'm glad we're doing this together." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. "Me too. Just promise me we'll get through this." Michael pulled back and looked her in the eyes. "I promise." With the evidence securely packed, they left the cabin, ready to face whatever the next few hours would bring. The air was crisp with the dawn of a new day, filled with possibilities both dangerous and hopeful. As they made their way to the meeting point, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a storm. But with Michael by her side, she felt ready to face it head-on. The meeting point, referred to as Charlie, was an abandoned house on the outskirts of Montauk. Sarah and Michael arrived 15 minutes early, parking their rented car a safe distance away. "Remember," Michael said as they walked towards the house, "if anything feels off, don't hesitate. Run." Sarah nodded, clutching the evidence tightly. Every step towards the decrepit house made her heart race faster. As they approached the back door, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was a woman in her mid-40s, her gray hair tied back in a tight bun. "Thompson," she greeted with a curt nod. "I see you brought company." "Agent Rodriguez," Michael replied. "This is Sarah. She's been dragged into this as much as I have." Rodriguez studied Sarah for a moment before nodding. "Let's get inside. It's not safe to be out in the open." The interior of the house was surprisingly clean, in stark contrast to its rundown exterior. Rodriguez led them to a back room where a laptop and various communication equipment were set up. "Show me what you have," she demanded. Sarah handed over the flash drive, and Rodriguez began examining the files. As she scrolled through the data, her eyes widened. "My God," she muttered. This is even bigger than we thought." Suddenly, the sound of screeching tires outside made everyone freeze. "Shit," Rodriguez cursed, drawing her gun. "We've been compromised." Michael pulled Sarah behind an old sofa, while Rodriguez positioned herself near the window. The front door burst open with a loud crash. Heavy footsteps echoed through the house. "FBI!" a voice shouted. "Everyone, hands up!" Rodriguez glanced at Michael, confusion in her eyes. "These aren't my men," she whispered. Before anyone could react, the door to the room was kicked open. Armed agents swarmed in, their weapons trained on them. And then, a familiar figure stepped into the room. Detective Callahan. Well, he grinned, his face alight with triumph. "Look what we have here. A little gathering of conspirators." Sarah felt her blood run cold. How had Callahan found them? "This is a misunderstanding," Rodriguez began, but Callahan cut her off. "Save it, Rodriguez. We know you're in on it with Thompson." All of you are under arrest for obstruction of justice, theft of confidential documents, and, oh yes, attempting to subvert a legitimate federal investigation. Michael slowly stood, his hands raised. Callahan, you don't understand. The evidence we have will be confiscated and properly examined. Callahan interrupted with a sinister smile. Sarah watched in horror as the agents handcuffed Michael and Rodriguez. She knew it was only a matter of seconds before it was her turn. But then, something unexpected happened. One of the agents accompanying Callahan suddenly pointed his gun at the detective. "Everyone, freeze!" he shouted. "Detective Callahan, you are under arrest for corruption, obstruction of justice, and abuse of power." The room erupted into chaos. Callahan tried to reach for his gun, but he was quickly subdued. More agents stormed in, clearly aligned with Rodriguez. "Sorry for the theatrics," the agent who turned on Callahan said, removing the handcuffs from Michael and Rodriguez. "We needed to be sure who was on which side." Sarah stepped out from behind the sofa, still trembling. What just happened?" Rodriguez smiled for the first time since they had met. "Undercover operation. We've been suspecting Callahan of corruption for some time, so we set this up." Michael looked at Sarah, relief washing over his face. "It's over," he said softly. "It's really over." As Callahan was led away, screaming threats and accusations, Sarah felt the weight of the past days finally lift. They had done it. The truth would come out. Rodriguez approached them. "You two were incredibly brave. Thanks to you, we can finally dismantle this network of corruption." Sarah looked at Michael, seeing the man she fell in love with, the man who risked everything for the truth. She took his hand, squeezing it tightly. "What happens now?" she asked. Rodriguez smiled. Now we start cleaning up this city. And you two have a lot of debriefing to do." As they exited the house, the rising sun cast a hopeful glow over the scene. Sarah knew the days ahead would be intense, with testimonies, potential threats, and a lot of media attention. But looking at Michael beside her, she knew they would face it all together. The long night of corruption and lies was finally coming to an end, and a new day of justice and truth was just beginning. 6 months had passed since that fateful night in Montauk. The autumn sun bathed Central Park in golden hues as Sarah walked hand in hand with Michael, both enjoying a rare moment of peace. The past months had been a whirlwind of emotions and events. The evidence they had gathered, combined with the FBI's undercover operation, had led to the largest corruption investigation in New York's history. High-ranking politicians, influential businessmen, and corrupt officials had been arrested in a series of raids that rocked the city to its core. Sarah and Michael had become public figures almost overnight. Interviews, testimonies, and even death threats had become part of their new reality. But amidst the chaos, they had found strength in each other. "It's still hard to believe it's all over," Sarah commented, watching a group of children play near the lake. Michael squeezed her hand gently. "It's not entirely over. We still have a lot of work to do." He was right. Although the key players were behind bars, the process of cleaning up the city and restoring public trust would be long and arduous. They sat down on a bench, savoring the peaceful moment. Sarah looked at Michael, noticing the subtle changes in his face. A few more lines, a more serious expression. But his eyes still held the same determination she had always loved. "You know," she began, "with everything that's happened, we never really talked about us." Michael turned to her, a soft smile on his lips. "Sarah, you were my anchor through all this. Even when I thought I'd lost you forever, the thought of you kept me going." Sarah felt tears welling up. "I never stopped loving you, Michael. Not even when I believed you were dead." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. "I've been carrying this with me for months, waiting for the right moment," he said, opening the box to reveal a simple yet elegant ring. "Sarah Thompson, will you do me the honor of marrying me?" For a moment, the world seemed to stop. Sarah looked at the ring, then at Michael's hopeful eyes. All the trials, the dangers, the nights of uncertainty, it had all led to this moment. "Yes," she whispered, tears of joy streaming down her face. 1,000 times yes. Michael slipped the ring onto her finger, and they kissed, oblivious to the curious stares of passers-by. When they finally pulled apart, both were grinning from ear to ear. "So, what do we do now?" Sarah asked, admiring the ring on her finger. Michael stood, holding out his hand to her. "Now we continue our fight. There's still a lot of work to do to make sure this never happens again." Sarah nodded, understanding. They had become symbols of hope and integrity for the city. It was a responsibility they couldn't ignore. "And after that?" she teased, a sparkle in her eyes. Michael smiled, pulling her close. "After that, we build our life together, one day at a time." As they walked through the park, hand in hand and hearts full of hope, Sarah reflected on the incredible journey that had brought them here. What started with a familiar watch at a thrift shop had turned into a saga of corruption, danger, and redemption. But above all, it was a love story, a love that had survived death, separation, and the greatest challenges life could throw at them. The sun began to set over the Manhattan skyline, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange. It was the end of a chapter, but the beginning of something new and exciting. Sarah looked at Michael, her heart overflowing with love and gratitude. Together, they had faced the impossible and come out stronger. And together, they would face whatever challenges the future held. Because in the end, that was what mattered. Not the dangers they had faced or the secrets they had uncovered, but the love that had brought them together and the promise of a shared future. As night fell over New York, Sarah and Michael walked towards their future, side by side, ready to write the next chapter of their extraordinary story. Thank you very much for listening to this story. Comment below what you thought of the ending and from which city you're listening to us. If you enjoyed the story and want to hear more, click on the next story that's appearing on your screen now. Leave your like and subscribe to our channel so we can build a huge community that shares inspiring stories together. See you soon.